evening, everyone, and I must apologize for the delay there. Really apologize for that. In the midst of all of this, being at home and taking care of things at home and children, well, not children, child, much less if I had multiple children, but in the midst of all of that, trying to schedule everything and have everything on time was a little challenging today, but thank God everything has been in place. So what we're going to do now, of course, without much delay, we are continuing in our journey through the Old Testament, and we know we have reached the book of Exodus. As a matter of fact, we basically almost finished the book. We're at the very end, just 2 more slides really to do. So we just want to complete that book of Exodus very quickly, and really, which we're going to be mainly covering today, would be the book of Leviticus. That'll be the main book we're covering. And just to give a little overview and explanation again, remember, the purpose of this is to give a general overview of the book, and what that means obviously is that I have to try my best in terms of balancing the amount of depth I go into, and at the same time, trying to finish quickly. So please keep that in mind, right? Keep that in mind that really it's an overview of the book, right? Because if we go into too much detail, it'll end up taking way too long to complete a book, and that's not the main thing that we after in terms of taking too long, but rather we want to complete this quickly. And what we want to achieve is at the end of this, when we finish this series, that in the broad sense or in the general sense, the people of God will be able to have a good overview of the Old Testament scriptures, right? So that is that. So let's begin with a word of prayer, and we're going to jump quickly back into Exodus and complete it. So Father, again, we give you praise and thanks for the privilege of being able to have your word, have the scriptures, be able to study your word. And Lord, we must always give thanks for all of the tools that we have in our generation. We have so many Bible study guides, we have commentaries, we have different versions, we could study the original languages, could do a lot of depth of research. And we must give you praise for that. We also give you thanks, Lord, again for all of the men and women who would have dedicated their time and effort and energy to translations, versions, Bible study tools, so that we now could look at these things and study them and have a great and better understanding of your word. And Father, also we ask that by your Spirit you will give us understanding of the scriptures as we go through them. Help us to understand your word, and as a result renew our minds and change our behavior. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So let's go into things here. So we were last at Exodus, and let me get the last slide that we were on. Let's see here. We were on the slide with the golden calf. So just to quickly recap what took place. Remember, Moses went back up into the mountain, and he went there to get, the law from God, the 10 commandments on the stones, etc. Right? And while he was up there and the people were waiting at the foot of the mountain, remember, considerable time had passed, 40-day period. And basically the people at the foot of the mountain started saying, what is going on with this Moses guy? We don't know what happened to him. We don't know whether he alive. We don't know whether he dead. We really don't know what's going on with that gentleman. And as a result, they called on Moses to say, yeah, what brother? We want you to make us gods who will go before us. And just remember that they had just entered into a covenant just some days ago, entered into a covenant with the Lord. And the covenant said at the very beginning of the covenant, the commandment of the covenant was that they were not supposed to have any other gods. And look how quickly, right, for that 40-day period while Moses was on the mountain, look how quickly they are basically saying, here, what, we don't know what's going on with Moses, and they have basically overthrown the very covenant they made with the Lord just a few days ago. So they said to Aaron, to make them gods who will go before us. And that's when Aaron takes the golden earrings from the people and he melts them down basically and makes a calf. And that calf, they started worshipping it and engaging in revelry, etc. So they were fetting in essence and celebrating the new God that they created for themselves. And that's when the Lord said to Moses, listen, these people have quickly broken the law, the covenant that I had just made with them. And he says, listen, these are stiff-necked people. Leave me, let me destroy all of these people. That's what he's saying to Moses. And he says, listen, I will make of you a great nation, which, again, I pointed this out last week, the fact that in the midst of God's threats to destroy the people, he is still remembering his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because remember, Moses is one of their descendants, and God was saying, yeah, but I will destroy them. And that promise I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to make of them a great nation, I will make that great nation from you. In other words, I will start over from scratch with you, right, and fulfill my promise. And that's when Moses intercedes and he says to God, no, I don't want you to do that. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So he says, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and the promise he made to them, which God certainly did. Remember, he didn't forget that at all. As a matter of fact, we know that because he said to Moses, I'll make of you a great nation, showing that he certainly did remember the covenant that he made to them. But Moses basically intercedes on behalf of the people, and he's saying, listen, the Egyptians, will mock and say, listen, God wasn't able to bring them into the promised land. Remember, they had gotten this great deliverance from the land of Egypt. So Moses is basically interceding on behalf of the people with God, saying in essence, please don't destroy them. And God relents and says, okay, I would not destroy them based on your intercession, which of course shows the power of interceding on behalf of others. All right, very, very important principle there. So then Moses goes down right from the mountain, and he is very angry, obviously, that these people had broken the covenant with the Lord, which they had just made. And think about this guy Moses, after he went through, for those who were here last week, after he went through all of that work of doing the sacrifices and all this official covenant ceremony to enter the people into this great covenant with God, and then just a few days after, for them to break the covenant, that certainly is frustrating. So he was very angry. And he throws down the stone tablets that he had with the 10 Commandments. He breaks them. And he destroys the golden calf that the people had made, or more specifically, Aaron had made. And then Moses says, listen, who is on the Lord's side? Right? Remember, these people are fetting and enjoying themselves. And Moses just goes in there and says, here, what? Who is on the Lord's side? And the Levites, the tribe of Levi, gathered to him and said, yes, we are on the Lord's side, and we are willing to kill anybody who is not on God's side. He says, listen, kill brother and neighbor. In other words, anybody who is continuing in this revelry and in this worshipping of this false god and not stopping that act, I want you to basically kill them. Whether they are your brother, whether they are your neighbor, it doesn't matter. We need to stop this idolatry from taking place. And because of the faithfulness of the Levites, where they were willing to even kill their own brother and their own neighbor, because of their great devotion to God, that is when the Levites were chosen as ministers for the tabernacle. So God basically said, because of that act of devotion that these Levites did, he says that you all are going to be ministers in the tabernacle. And we already covered that tabernacle last week. So these Levites would be working together with the priests in all of the affairs of the tabernacle, or later on the temple when it was made into an actual physical building. And just one I was mentioning this last week, I didn't point out that distinction. But tabernacle and temple is referring to the same thing, the same house of God that God instructed for Moses to build. The only difference is that the tabernacle form was in a tent form. So in other words, they could have built up that tent and broken it down, because remember, they were moving through the wilderness. They were journeying through the wilderness. So when it's time to move, obviously the tabernacle has to go as well. So it was in a tent type of form where they could pitch the tent, set it up, and then break down the tent and move. Right? But later on, a physical temple was built, which is what David wanted to build for the Lord, for those who remember that. And that is where the tabernacle took on an actual physical structure, or like a concrete structure, what we will call today. Just felt the need to explain that. Right? So this is where we are. So that's how the Levites were chosen as the ministers of the tabernacle. So let's move forward now and complete Exodus quickly. So next we have the renewal. So obviously, remember, they have broken the covenant that they had made with God. So now what Moses wants to do is to renew that covenant which they had made, to renew it again. In other words, to undo that breaking of the covenant that they had done. So Moses again intercedes, right? He intercedes again on behalf of the people. And God says, however, he says, go to the land. However, I'm not going to go with you. I'm speaking to the people in general here. Because you all are stiff-necked, obviously, because of the quick disobedience that they did. It simply means you all hardened. That's how we use that terminology today. You all are hardened people, stiff-necked. And if I go along with you all are going to die. I'm going to end up killing you all. So he is basically saying, yeah, you all could go to the promised land, but I am not going to go along with you. In other words, my manifest presence, and we spoke about that last week, where God would manifest his presence in physical form. He's basically saying, I'm not going to give that to you all again, right? And people were very sad at that. And Moses had to go and intercede again so that God would not do that. In other words, refrain from going along with them. But next we have something called the tent of meeting. And this tent of meeting is very, very important. Some important things to learn from this tent of meeting here. So the tent of meeting, this was a tent that Moses used to set up on the outside of the camp, right? So Moses would set up this tent on the outside of the camp. And in that tent is where God would speak to Moses. So in other words, God will come to that camp or manifest his presence in that camp, in that tent, that was outside the camp, And there is where God would speak or communicate with Moses. And it is said that the conversation was like a face-to-face conversation. And what that meant, if we could grasp how amazing this was, it meant that when God's presence revealed itself in that tent, right, that makeshift tent that Moses made, as Moses spoke, God would have been responding, obviously, from the manifestation of his presence in the tent. So God would speak, Moses would respond, Moses would speak, God would respond. That's what it meant by they had a face-to-face conversation, which really is very unique. Extremely, extremely unique in the biblical narrative. It's one of the reasons why Moses is seen as this really special guy, that he got to do that. Obviously, in times past, God would speak to persons in visions, in dreams, and voices, and things like that. But this type of face-to-face, direct conversation back and forth was really something special. So Moses intercedes again on behalf of the people, remember, because he doesn't want God to not go along with them as he had threatened. But he also asks, he says, I want you to show me your glory. And Moses is asking God here to show his glory or his divine. He wants to see a divine revelation of God himself. And God says, listen, I will show you my glory, but I'm not going to show you my face. And that's a very, very serious and important thing to take note of. Because even Moses, as great as that guy was and as intimate as he had this face to face, so understand this, and that is why I want to make a distinction here. Because some persons may say, how is it that God is saying he is not showing his face, but right above it says that he had a face-to-face conversation with God? And to understand the difference between that, I'm saying, when he was in the tent of meeting, right, God would have manifested his presence in the tent, but it was not, or in other words, God directly. So in other words, the actual form of God as he is in heaven, that is not what was taking place in the tent here. Just a manifestation of his presence in the tent. What Moses was asking for, he was like, I want to actually see your glory. In other words, the way you appear in heaven. That's what Moses was asking for. A really, really magnificent request, to be honest. So God says, I will show you my glory. I will show you my glory, but not my face. So this is where God is saying, I'm going to actually show you my actual form. My actual form I will show you, but you cannot see my face. And this ties in again the importance of this. We talked about this as for those who were with us in the series. And I made the point where we mentioned us being created in the image of God. And I was saying that in all the visions of God, when the prophets saw visions of God, they were not seeing any kind of tentacled creature or any kind of weird looking thing. They were seeing the form of an actual human looking structure, human being, which really ties into the fact that we are created in the image of God in that sense. And that is even shown here, because when God had this revelation of himself to Moses, it was in an actual, the form was similar to the same type of form that a human being would have. The only thing is he couldn't get to see God's face. Right? And what is interesting is that the face of God will be seen by his people in the new earth. So in the new earth, Revelation talks about that then, at that point in time, when all things are made new and the old world that we are in right now is destroyed and sin is dealt with and we are in resurrected bodies and we are in the new earth, in that place, all of us are going to actually get to see the divine face of God, even though Moses here was not allowed to, which is really amazing. So new tablets were cut by Moses. Remember, he broke the last set that were given to him by God, the 10 Commandments, so on. And the covenant was renewed, remember, to deal with the fact that they had broken covenant with God by worshipping that golden calf. Again, I apologize for these background noises. these dogs, doesn't be easy, right? But the covenant is renewed. A summary of the laws are restated, obviously, to kind of overdo the fact that, or redo the fact that they had broken the covenant. So the covenant is kind of restated again, right? And the tablets of testimony, the 10 Commandments, are rewritten, right, on the new tablets that Moses would cut. So basically, this was a kind of renewal to deal with the fact that they had broken covenant by the golden calf incident. So this is where Moses goes for 40 days and 40 nights again, a second time, no bread and water on that mountain. And this is where he is doing that covenant renewal now. Right, and this shows divine sustenance, obviously. No bread and no water. That is literally impossible to happen for any normal human being. Which means, obviously, that God himself was sustaining Moses while he was on that mountain. And 40 represents the number of completion. Right, remember Christ had a 40-day fast before his ministry. Right, and Christ's 40-day fast is sort of similar reflection of this 40-day period that Moses spent on the mountain. So Moses returns, and this is now something very important for us to learn here. Very, very important for us to learn. When Moses returns from the mountain, his face is actually shining, and that is quite literally taking place. So his face was literally glowing or shining because of the fact that he had spent that amount of time in God's presence, right? However, when he came down, and obviously the people see him with his face just glowing like that, they were very afraid of that, terrified. That, if you could think about that in reality, that would honestly be a kind of very weird and a very frightening thing to see somebody's face glowing like that. But there's something very critical to learn in this. So this is what happened, right? So his face is glowing, right? So they veil his face. They put a veil. So back in those days, just like women would put these veils over their face, right? To hide themselves, hide their beauty. Moses did that. He put a veil over his face when he would go and converse with the Israelites because of the fact that his face was glowing. However, when he went in the tent of meeting, which we covered, this tent of meeting, he used to go and meet with God. When he went to that tent of meeting, he would remove that veil and have his face-to-face conversation with God in the tent of meeting. Now, there's something very important about that Paul picks up on in the New Testament. And he says that veiling represents the blindness of those who are under the old covenant. It represents those who, and he uses this analogy here of this veiling that Moses did. He used that to refer to people who did not want to release or let go of the old covenant. So in other words, he said that these people are blinded. So if you would recall, remember, in the time when Paul was ministering, there were many of the Jews who did not take heed to the new covenant which Christ ushered in. They rejected Christ as the Messiah and all of that, and they said, we are going to stay holding on to the old covenant. We don't want to see or hear anything about this Jesus Christ. And Paul is saying this text here is a sort of foreshadowing or an example of what is taking place. So in other words, just like the Israelites were not able to see the glory of God, right, where Moses, his face was reflecting the glory of God, and those people, out of their terror and fear, they wanted Moses' face to be veiled. Paul is saying that is actually very similar to what is happening today, well, in his day, that is, of the Israelites who did not want to see the true glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Really, really amazing. But he also says the text also represents the face-to-face conversing that a believer has with Christ. So in other words, Paul's point was that just as Moses went to that tent of meeting, and he was not, in other words, blinded, or he did not have to veil his face or anything like that. He had that face-to-face conversing with God. Paul basically said, in like manner, in other words, opposite to those who were under the old covenant and refused to look at Christ, he is saying we are acting similar to Moses, where we are not veiling our faces, right? And we are not blinded to the glory of Christ. We actually, with unveiled face, behold the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In other words, just a kind of analogy, right? Paul is saying that this situation with Moses is a type of foreshadowing to what takes place today. So people who do not want to let go of the old covenant and still want to hold on to it and do not want to accept the new covenant and Jesus Christ and all of that, they are like the children of Israel who were blinded from seeing the glory and the greatness of God. Really, really interesting how Paul makes that analogy. So the final slide here as we complete the book of Exodus. So the tabernacle construction, where they had to make remember, we covered this last week, where God gave all the instructions about how to make the tabernacle and what you have to put inside of it, etc. Now is when a contribution was collected from the people, in other words, to make or to build that tabernacle. And it was from whoever is of a generous heart. So this was a free will offering. They were not obligated to do so. Moses just asked for those who are interested in the furtherance of God's tabernacle and you want to give a contribution towards this building, you can give. And the people gave in excess. In other words, way more than was actually needed. It reached that point where the people had to be restrained, and Moses said, listen, we have enough stuff. You don't have to bring any more. And this same principle of free will giving is a principle in the New Testament, and Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians 9:7. All of the giving in the New Testament is based on free will, right? All of the giving in the New Testament is free will giving. We give of our free will, not based on any obligation. So there were certain things in the Old Covenant that they were obligated to give, where you had to do this by law, by commandment, by instruction. But in the New Covenant, all our giving is of a free will. In other words, we're giving not based on any command where we have to do this. We just give in freely, right, out of the joy of our hearts that we want to give to the Lord. So skillful workers were gathered by free will to basically set up and design and build the things for the tabernacle. God specially empowers his chosen workers, so those people who were chosen, who had to actually build or make the things for the tabernacle. God empowers them by his Spirit to do that work. So the tabernacle and its articles are constructed. So in all of these chapters in Exodus talks about that, where they made everything that was needed for the tabernacle. The tabernacle and the priests were anointed and consecrated. And if you remember, we talked about the fact that priests had to be anointed for service, right? And the glory of God descends and fills the tabernacle, and Moses is unable to enter. So in other words, that tabernacle, when they finished, built it and set up everything, God's glory descended. Remember, we talked about the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. So God's glory actually descended. You could have actually seen that with your own eyes. Descended and filled the tabernacle, showing obviously God's approval and acceptance of this tabernacle, and showing that intercession that Moses made, where he asked God, he said, please forgive the people. Remember, God had says, I'm not going to go along with you all anymore. It shows that intercession by Moses was successful, because we see here God is actually saying, I will allow my presence to be with you all in the tabernacle. And that's where we have the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, a visible presence of God that they could have seen in that tabernacle. And that pillar of cloud and pillar of fire led the people for 40 years in the wilderness. So just by way of a little visual example, right? This obviously is not a perfect image, but the image is to just help us to have an understanding of what it would have looked like. So this is how, remember I said the tabernacle was in a tent form. So this would have been the tent here that they had made. So they could have broken this down and pick it up. Remember the altar, remember the laver, we talked about all of that. And this that you're seeing here is what quite literally took place. So in other words, there was this pillar, that's what we're talking about, that was going up, right, from the tabernacle here into heaven. And that pillar, it was just a representation of the fact that God's presence was with them, and they could have actually seen that pillar. So during the day it was a pillar of cloud, right? So just like the clouds in the sky, a pillar like this here, but in the form of clouds. And in the night, a pillar of fire, right? And this is basically what it would have looked like, and everybody would have been in their tents surrounding the tabernacle. This is an example of what took place. So that's the end of Exodus, right? We have completed the book of Exodus there. This is a quick overview of all of the things we looked at in Exodus, right? Section 2, where we looked at where they entered into the covenant, the law, and the tabernacle building. So we're going to just pause quickly for about 2 minutes, and we're going to start in Leviticus. we are back. Right, so jumping quickly into things because we really don't want to lose much time here at all. Let's go into the Old Testament book of Leviticus. Let's have an overview now of the book of Leviticus. So just by way of a quick introduction to the book. Now this term, this word Leviticus, right, that we use is from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Remember I spoke about that? The Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew, right? Old Testament Hebrew into Greek. So they used translations back then as well, right? In the times of Christ we're talking about, right? So they used a translation. And in this translation, where they translated, given that Greek was the predominant language that people were speaking, and in order for people to be able to understand the Bible, just like it's the same exact thing like we use translations today, English translations, obviously, of the original language. They had a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, or the LXX, which stands for 70, L being 50, X being 10, 60, and XX being 10, 70. For those who are interested, you could look into that. But in the LXX, or the Septuagint, right, it referred to this book as Leviticus in the Greek, right? So that's actually a Greek word. And that Greek word means things concerning the Levites. Remember, the Levites were those, we learned that just prior, that these were the persons who were given the task of helping out the priests in terms of the ministry and the affairs of the tabernacle. So therefore, they called this book, which dealt with a lot of the affairs of the tabernacle, such as the sacrifices and things like that, and the days, the feast days, and things to be done in the tabernacle. That's why they referred to the book as Leviticus, right, as a reason for that name. Some disagree because obviously the book of Leviticus covers a lot more than that. In other words, it's a lot more than things pertaining to the Levites. It talks about cleanliness and many other things, but that is just where that name came from, that Greek translation. The Hebrew title is Vayikra, right, in the Hebrew, and that means, and he called, from the first words of the book. So the first words of the book of Leviticus in Hebrew is, and he called, right, and one of the regular customs of the Hebrews was to title their book with the first words used in the book. They would usually just call the entire name of the book with those first words. So in the Hebrew form, this is the name of this book that we call Leviticus. So it's authored by Moses, right? It's the third of the 5 books of the Old Testament, which we call the Pentateuch, or the Law of Moses. When I say the 5 books of the Old Testament, not the entire Old Testament, obviously we know it has a lot more books than that. But the 5 that were written by Moses is called the Pentateuch. Pent, obviously, being 5, from where we get pentagon, pentagram, 5-sided shape. So Pentateuch was the 5 books of the Old Testament, which are also called the Law of Moses. Right, so this book covers matters pertaining to the sacrifices in the tabernacle, the ordination of the priests, ritual purity, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, very important day, we're going to get to that. Moral purity, in other words, how they're supposed to live clean, priestly qualifications, and rituals and feasts, which, as I said, why some persons disagree with calling it Leviticus, because it's all of these things really that are covered in the book, way more than anything pertaining to the Levites. But the overall theme of the book of Leviticus has a theme of holiness in the presence of a holy God. So in other words, God is holy, and likewise we as people serving him are supposed to be holy as well. Holy meaning set apart, pure, clean. All of these things are derived from that word holy, and we are supposed to be holy as well. As a matter of fact, the very famous phrase, be holy as I am holy, is a phrase that comes out of the book of Leviticus, which even in the New Testament we know that Peter quotes that phrase, right? So it's from the book of Leviticus, and the overall focus of that book is holiness. So let's look quickly at these sections in this book. Now this is how we're going to be going through. So we don't really have how I had section 1 and 2 for some of the other books we covered. We're really going to just be taking portions, right? So the portions we're going to look at are the 5 main offerings, the handling of the offerings, the priesthood ordination, and these, for those interested, these are the chapters and sections, right, where these things are covered. The laws on cleanness and uncleanness, or cleanliness and uncleanliness. The Day of Atonement, which is quite the most critical thing, really, one of the most important things that we learn in the book of Leviticus. Very important, that Day of Atonement. Book of Hebrews builds on that a lot. The handling and meaning of blood, right? How blood is supposed to be handled, the importance of what blood represents. The call to holiness. God calls them to a holy life, talks about what a holy life looks like, how they're supposed to behave. How they're supposed to behave, etc. And holy times, just special days in the law, right? All of these special days. We're going to look at all of these special days that the law had. The blessings and curses of the law, spoken about in Leviticus. And finally, vows and dedication, where people would make these vows or dedicate certain things to the Lord. The book ends by talking about the procedures of how to go about doing that. So these are the sections that we're going to be covering. I don't think we're going to finish all of these, right? But wherever we reach at 8 o'clock, we will stop at that point, right? So let's begin with the first one, obviously, of the 5 major offerings. So in the law, in the Old Covenant, in the offerings that they would make, so just remember, please, that when they were making offerings, they actually were bringing things to a literal altar. Spoke about that altar last week, a literal altar where they would burn things on that altar, burn animals on that altar, things that they were offering up to God, right? So there were 5 main types of offerings that were done on a regular basis. So in other words, when people will come into the tabernacle and say, listen, I want to make an offering to God, right? And they will come and that offering will be made on the altar that was there in the tabernacle. There were 5 main categories or main types of offerings that were done on a you could say a regular or day-to-day basis by people, right? People will come to the tabernacle to make these offerings, which is separate. Obviously, we had other special, unique offerings like Yom Kippur, which the priests only would do. But these 5 major offerings we're going to talk about here are those which the regular person would come to the tabernacle and make any one of these 5 types. So the first one is a burnt offering. A burnt offering. So a burnt offering, the intention or the purpose of it was to make atonement for the sin of the worshipper, or more specifically to appease the wrath of God. And this is a very important concept to understand, that sin incurs a punishment or a judgment, which is one of the things that people don't like to think about. But the fact is, when you commit a sin, there's a judgment or punishment that must be handed down for that sin that you have committed, because God is angry with the fact that you have committed that sin against him. So this burnt offering, where they would bring this animal, right, and offer it to God, was to appease God's wrath. So in other words, which is the same exact thing that happened with Christ. Christ, when he was on that cross, he was taking the punishment on our place, because the anger of God against our sin had to be pleased. In other words, that is how a just judge operates. For a judge to be just, he can't just let people get away. A punishment has to be handed down. right? So that is what this burnt offering was about. So the animal that had to be offered must be without blemish or fault. It couldn't have any problems, no lame kind of animal, no sick animal, no half-dead animal, obviously. Had to be without blemish, which immediately we could see how this is a type of foreshadowing of Christ here. The worshipper had to lay his hands on the offering, which was a symbolic thing. There was nothing magical or mystical about that. It was just an outward sign by laying his hands on the offering to basically show identification or a transfer, you could say, of my sin unto this animal. That we learned this already. That was not literally taking place, obviously. And we have learned already from the book of Hebrews that in reality, none of those sacrifices were actually atoning for anybody. They were just symbols pointing to Christ. So when they laid their hands on the animal, it was a way of symbolizing that I am transferring my sin on this animal. And then this animal is going to be taking the punishment or the wrath of God in my place. So the animal types that they could have offered were like a bull, sheep, goat, turtle doves, or pigeons. And obviously, we could see there in progression of things that were more expensive to things that were on the cheaper side, which persons could afford. So the offering is to be completely burnt, right? So the entire thing had to be burned. No part was kept at all. The entire offering was burnt on the altar. So they would put it on the altar. We saw that altar last week. That altar had fire underneath it. They would put the animal on that altar and burn the entire thing. That was what a burnt offering was. And this was obviously one of the most expensive types of offering. And the reason is because you're not going to keep anything. As we would see in some of the other offerings, a portion would be kept for the priest, or a portion the person could have gone back home with, or something like that. But not with a burnt offering, right? The entire thing is gone. So that was a burnt offering, one of the regular types that they would do. Next was a grain offering, And obviously we're talking about grain there, things from the field. And it was used for praise, worship, and sometimes when they're making divine petitions to God, they would offer this grain offering. And many times it was accompanied with other offerings. In other words, while they were doing another offering, whether it was burnt or whatever else, they would also offer a grain along with it. And again, this represented praise and worship to God. And sometimes when they were making divine petitions to God, asking God for something, they would offer these grain offerings. So some of the things offered in this grain offering was fine flour, which obviously is why it's called grain offering, because it's things from the field, flour. So fine flour was offered. Baked bread and wafers were offered. So the person would have made this, right? This baked bread and wafers, and bring it to offer to God. It couldn't have any yeast or honey in it, which was just a way of saying it shouldn't be contaminated by anything, right? And this was burnt on the altar, right? So they will put this offering on the altar and burn it, representing obviously offering this to God. But the purpose again of this was for praise and worship to God. So they brought the first fruits of the land, right? First fruits represents when the fields bring forth crops. The first batch of crops, right, is called the first fruits. Before the full batch arrives, the first batch of crops that came was called the first fruits. So many times the first fruits of the land were offered in these grain offerings, right? But these first fruits, so take note, and these grains couldn't be burnt on the altar. So understand the difference here. Understand the distinction here. One, they could have brought the fine flour, right? All of these are in the category of a grain offering. But they could have brought the fine flour and made bread and wafers, right? And this is flat bread, and not the kind of bread we have today, like raised loaves. This was flat bread. So they would make these bread or wafers, which would have no yeast or honey. Remember I said these things represent contamination. You could see many times where yeast represents sin. So in other words, a pure offering. This one was burnt on the altar. But the first fruits one right? Where they would bring things from the land, right? Things from their crops now. Remember, this was flour, which they would make bread. They could have offered that on the altar. But this first fruits of the land from the crops that they would reap, and the grain from those crops, that could not be burnt on the altar. Very important distinction there. All of the grain offerings had to be offered with salt, so it had to be seasoned with salt, right? And a portion was placed on the altar, and the remainder was given to the priest. So that is how this system worked. So when it says a portion offered on the altar, obviously we're talking about those things which could have been placed on the altar. So a portion of these would have been offered to God on the actual altar, right? Some of the bread, but the remainder of the bread from the batch that the person brought to the Lord, the remainder of that bread would be given to the priests. And this is how the priests will sustain. And I apologize, they're part of the wording, seeing there much, but as I was reading it out, that's what it says there, right? So a portion was offered on the altar and a remainder was given to the priest. That is the grain offering. And in the general sense, it was used for praise and worship and divine petitions made to God. The third one we have is something called a peace offering, right? A peace offering. And this offering was just an expression of worship. So where the person wanted to worship God, it's kind of similar, right, to the grain offering. But it was to celebrate the peace between God and the worshiper. So basically, when things went really well with the person, right, things were going good, God was very gracious to me, I succeeded in something, right, or I asked God for a request sometime before, and God answered me, or whatever it is, things like that, to celebrate the fact that I have this peace relationship with God, which was seen in the fact that He was blessing me and treating me well and all of that. We are at peace. They had these peace offerings to kind of worship God in response for that. So the animal, again, they would offer animals for this peace offering, had to be offered without blemish or without fault. All right. Again, the worshipper would lay hands on the offering, right, symbolizing again their identification with this offering that they are now giving up to God, identifying themselves with this offering. The animal types that they could have offered were from the herd, bulls, and from the flock, sheep or goats. That is what they could have offered in these peace offerings. So God is basically telling them what they could have given. In other words, you could make up your own type of peace offering. You had to give what God had said. Right? The specific animal parts that were offered were the fat, the kidneys, and the liver. These parts were burnt on the altar, but the rest of it was kept, right? The rest of the offering was kept. So that is how it worked. Remember, this is a little different. Remember the burnt offering, the entire animal was burnt up, not this one. This one, only certain parts of the offering were given on the altar. These parts here, right? These were burnt on the altar, but the rest, the person could have actually kept these things. In other words, the person could have kept those parts, the remaining of the animal, and they could have done what they wanted with that. If they wanted to have a feast, celebrate, or anything like that, they could have kept it. If they wanted to give it to the priest, or whatever it is they wanted to do with this, but the remainder of the animal was kept, right? And again, this was just a celebration. That's one of the reasons why the Lord allowed them to keep it, so they could go and have a feast and enjoy themselves. Because really, it was them expressing a celebration of their relationship of peace with God. Next, we had sin offerings. So those were peace offerings. Next, we had sin offerings. And these were to atone for unintentional sins and to purify the worshipper. To atone for sins now, which is again, obviously, type of similar to the burnt offering, type of similar. You could say that the sin offering is kind of like the other half of the burnt offering, right? Where the burnt offering dealt with the wrath of God, but the sin offering is doing the same thing, as the same atonement taking place. But this sin offering is now purifying the worshipper or cleansing the worshipper from their sin. In other words, that's obviously symbolic, as we have mentioned already. These things were not literally cleansing anybody's sins at all. They were just symbolic. So it was to atone for unintentional sins, and this term unintentional sins simply means sins that people committed, but it was not in rebellion against God. So there are little categories of sin that the Old Testament talked about. Unintentional sin simply means you do something wrong. At the end of the day, we all of these sins that we do, we know what we're doing. But the phrase unintentional was a phrase that was used to mean you do not commit this sin with a high, arrogant hand against God. Basically saying, God, I don't care about you. I don't care about what your law says. I'm going to do my own thing. I don't business. Those type of sins were not covered. And obviously, anyone who is a genuine believer in God does not commit sins like that. People in the world do that. Basically say, I don't care about God. People who are of faith, while they do sin, those are not sins that they do out of a wicked or intentional heart. They do it where they stumble, they make mistakes, etc. But the point is that this was to atone for those sins and to purify the worshipper, cleanse the person. So again, the animal had to be offered without blemish. The worshipper had to lay their hands on the offering. You already know what that symbolizes. But different rules in terms of the sin offering were for different classes of people. So in other words, the sin offering for a priest was slightly different to the sin offering of a normal, regular person in the community. One of the things that I personally believe that this was to point to was the seriousness of when priests and community leaders sinned as opposed to regular persons. Now, obviously, we know that whether a priest sin or whether a pastor sin or a normal person sin, at the end of the day, sin is sin in the sight of God, or sin is serious. However, the reason why there were different rules for these different classes is because of how these categories of people represented God. In other words, had an influence on the rest of people. So obviously, as a leader, since you as a priest have a vast influence on people, when you sin, the consequences are greater, right? The consequences are greater. And what is interesting is that even the book of James talks about that, where he says people who are ministers or leaders will be judged with greater strictness. So kind of seeing that here in that. All right, so the blood sprinkled on the veil, that is the blood of these animals that were offered in the sin offering. The blood was sprinkled on the veil in the tabernacle, right? They sprinkled some of the blood on the veil. Obviously, the veil there, remember, God was behind that veil in the Holy of Holies. And the obvious imagery there is that this blood, I am offering this blood here, right, for my sin, right, to cleanse me. I'm presenting that blood to God, right? That is what the purpose why it was sprinkled on the veil. And some was also placed on the horns of the altar, right? Some was also placed on the horns of the altar, right? For the priests and the community, right? When they, same thing. Now notice this. When the priests and the community leaders, right? The priests and these persons in the community leaders, when they sinned, they had to place that blood on the horns of the incense altar. So the fat and the kidneys and the liver were offered on the altar for this sin offering, and the remainder was burned outside of the camp. The remainder of the animal had to be taken outside of the camp and burned. And what is interesting is that the book of Hebrews picks up on this, making a connection with this and Christ by saying that just as the blood of these animals had to be taken outside of the camp and burned, in the same way, Jesus was taken outside of the gate of the city. Remember, he suffered on the outskirts, the outside of Jerusalem, to purify the people, right? Hebrews says Jesus was basically reflecting that same thing. And finally, guilt offerings. Guilt offering is the final type of offering. This was to atone for the guilt incurred by the person who sinned, right? So when this person who sinned, a person who did something wrong, and they incurred this guilt, they were guilty for some wrong that they had done, there was this guilt offering. So for example, when they would do things like they break a vow, they made a vow with somebody and they broke the vow, or they committed some kind of crime, they stole from somebody, right? And that guilt, where they were in that category now of guilty for what they had done, that is where guilt offerings came in to deal with that. So they had restitution had to be made for the crimes that they did. So when they did something wrong against somebody else, broke some covenant that they were supposed to keep, or anything like that, they made a vow to God and they end up breaking it unintentionally or whatever it is, that guilt that they incurred for doing that, this guilt offering was to deal with that. Right, so the animal offered again had to be without blemish, without fault, and the animal to be offered for guilt offering was a ram. So God was specific that this is what you have to offer for a guilt offering. What we want to see here, obviously, is the fact that Christ, with those 5 major offerings, fulfills every single one of those 5 major offerings. Christ fulfills every single one. Burnt offering, how does he fulfill that? Remember, burnt offering represents the judgment, the anger, appeasing the anger of God for sin. So the total judgment for sin, Jesus taking the wrath and punishment of God. And these passages, Romans 3:5, 1 John 4:10, talks about that. So just as the burnt offering was taking the wrath of God by being completely burned, Jesus took the wrath of God in our place. The grain offering, which was an offering of worship, right, that we offered to worship God. We talked about the grain offering to celebrate, give worship to God. In the same way, through Christ, or because of what Christ has done, now we could offer pure worship to God. And the reason why we could offer acceptable worship to God is on the basis of what Christ has done. So our petitions, remember with grain offerings, they would make these petitions to God. Our petitions can now be answered because of what Christ has done for us. So now we don't need to go and offer actual grain, right? We can just worship God and we can make our petitions to God, and on the basis of what Christ has done for us, these things will be heeded or accepted by God. These passages talk about how our worship is now accepted because of what Christ has done. Peace offering, obviously, because of what Christ has done, there is restoration of peace and fellowship between God and man through Christ's sacrifice. So just as the peace offering was done to celebrate the peace that the person shared with their fellowship with God and how God was treating them well and all of that, Christ fulfilled that peace offering, where now we could give praise and glory and thanks to God. We don't have to do the actual physical offering like they did. We can just give praise and thanks to God because of the peace and fellowship that we share with Him. These passages talk about that. And again, that peace between God and man came about because of Christ's sacrifice. Then we have the sin offering, which we talked about. The sin offering was to purify the person. Remember, the burnt was to take the judgment. The sin offering was to cleanse or purify the person. And we know, of course, that Jesus, when He bore our sins in His sacrifice, He purified us before God on the basis of what Christ has done for us. We have been cleansed from our sins. So taking of the judgment is one thing, but our sin also is cleansed or purified. We are made pure and clean before God. And that was what the sin offering symbolized. And the guilt offering, obviously, Jesus takes away our guilt before God. So there's no longer need for a feeling of guilt and unworthiness on the basis of what Christ has done. Hebrews talks about that. Hebrews says on the basis of what Christ has done, we are supposed to have no more consciousness of sins, meaning no longer feeling guilty, no longer going around bearing or carrying that guilty feeling for the sins that we have done, because we know that Christ has cleansed it and taken it away. No more need for that feeling of guilt. So whereas before they had to offer actual offering to do that, Christ fulfills that for us. So we no longer need to feel that guilt. So it's amazing how all of these 5 major offerings, Christ fulfilled that. So all of these things really were pointing to a work that Christ would do on our behalf. Remember, at the end of the day, the entire law and all of these sacrifices were pointing to Christ, pointing to something that Christ would accomplish on our behalf. And we're seeing how each one of these regular offerings, Christ fulfills the meaning of these things. Christ has fulfilled them for us. Really, really amazing, that foreshadowing there. Next, we have the handling of these offerings. So in other words, when the priest now was engaging in his act of offering these animals to God and bringing them into the temple, and all of the, in other words, the details of how he is supposed to go about doing it, that is spoken of here. So the priests were instructed on the exact method in which each sacrifice is to be offered. So in other words, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how you're supposed to offer the animal. Right, all of the details, we obviously not going to go into all of that. The reality is that God specifically told them, this is how you have to do it. And one of the things, the principles there, obviously is the one of order and discipline, requirements and protocol. In other words, when you're making these offerings to me, you're not doing it in an anyhow fashion. You're not doing it however you please. Right? That is the overall point here, right? These offerings had to be acceptable to God, and for them to be acceptable, you have to handle them or offer them in the specific way which I say. And obviously that demonstrated our reverence for God. So a person or a priest who ignored these instructions and says, I'm going to offer it however I want, and we see an example of that where this guy's sons, his name isn't coming to me. But there was a priest, a guy, and his sons were going quite opposite to this. In other words, the protocols that were supposed to be done with how the offerings were supposed to be handled, they ignored that, and they ended up receiving judgments for that. So offerings must be acceptable, they must be offered in the proper way, and they are acceptable through Christ. In other words, these passages talk about it is on the basis of Christ that the offerings we make today, obviously not of animals, right, but our offerings of praise and worship and service to God, they are acceptable on the basis of Christ. However, at the same time, we have to understand this same principle here. And this principle obviously is that when we are offering to God worship, we're not doing it however we so please. You have to do it in a way that honors God, as a principle that we learn from that. Next, the fire on the altar was never to stop burning, as an amazing thing, right? The altar, the fire below the altar in that tabernacle had to keep going. It was wrong or sinful for that flame to ever go out. Really, really interesting. One of the things that obviously pointed to, right, is the fact that none of those offerings really were truly fulfilling anything. That's why that altar had to keep burning, and everything was perpetual, had to be done over and over in this old tabernacle, old covenant, because in reality the ultimate fulfillment of those things were in Christ. So that altar, the fire of that altar had to keep burning. The offerings could only be eaten by priests, and these priests represented God's holiness, so only priests could have eaten these offerings which we covered before. When they brought, remember, sometimes part of the offerings were taken and given. Only the priests were supposed to eat those things. The offerings were continuously considered as holy. This is very important. Consistently, God kept repeating about the offerings. It is most holy, it is most holy, it is most holy. Obviously repeating the point to the priests and the Levites that this thing offering that you're handling here is something that is holy, and therefore you need to treat it with a form of reverence and respect, right? Handle it as something holy. Things that it touched became holy, right? And the offerings, when they were burnt, the ashes of the offerings were also considered holy, right? So that's a very important principle, because it's a reflection of Christ in this way. Even though Christ is bearing our sin, he remains holy. Just as these offerings, they made these offerings, even though whether it was a sin offering or whatever it is, the offering was to be considered as holy consistently, and which is an exact reflection of Christ, where even though he is bearing our sin, it doesn't mean he is not holy anymore. He continues to remain holy consistently. So do not misunderstand. And some persons, we need to be very careful where talked about Christ bearing our sin or becoming sin for us. That does not mean he became sinful. It does not mean that at all. It simply means that Christ was taking the punishment for our sin in our place. But while he was doing all of that, he remained holy. And these passages mention that very clearly, that consistently we have to view Christ as holy, even though he is our sin bearer. Do not think that he somehow became an unholy person. He did not. So the offerings which had its blood brought into the sanctuary cannot be eaten. And the obvious point there is that these offerings are being done for atonement for your sin. And therefore for these, where the blood is brought into the sanctuary and used for atonement, we don't want you eating those offerings, right? The fat and the blood, God was saying, fat and blood. This is, oh yes, now remember something very important pertaining to this. God said to them that fat and blood, I don't want you eating fat and blood. And sometimes people find, well, why is that? Why did God have this command that he didn't want his people eating blood? What is the big deal with eating blood? And it is because of the fact that blood is being used for sin offerings. And God wanted to maintain in the mind of the people the seriousness of sacrifices and sin offerings, that we're dealing with atonement for sin here. So that is why I don't want you all eating blood, because of what blood represents, right? Next, we have the ordination of the priests, right? When the priests were ordained for service. So for these things, we can pick up a little faster, right? Not much explanation needed here. So before being ordained as a priest, they had to complete this ordination process, or a little ceremony that they had to go through before they could have functioned as priests. So part of that ceremony is they had to bathe in water. They would be clothed in the priestly garment, and they would pour anointing oil on them. And I think this is probably one of the things I will pause to explain slightly, is that pouring of anointing oil was to represent that this person, the oil, was a symbol of the Spirit of God. That's what the oil represented. So this pouring of the oil on the person was a way of saying symbolically, right? Please don't think that there's any kind of simmy-dimmy taking place here, right? That was just a symbol. That oil is not magical. That oil is doesn't have any kind of special magical properties in it. It was to symbolize that this person, right, the Spirit of God is going to be overshadowing this person and empowering this person for service. That's why they poured anointing oil on the person. That's all it meant. They had to offer a sin offering and a burnt offering, right? And they had to be purified and consecrated. The altar, sorry, let me explain this a little bit. The altar had to be purified and consecrated for service as well. The altar that was going to be used, right, for offering of the animals and all the other things on it. So you had to purify and consecrate the altar, basically saying this is also going to be used for godly service. So they offered a ram of ordination, right, to ordain them, just like we have ordination ceremonies today for people who are ministers. It's basically similar to that. So they offer a ram, right, and they'll put blood on their right big toe, their right thumb, and their right ear, which simply meant that these members of mine are going to be used for godly service. That's all that meant. So there was a 7-day ordination process for these priests. They spent 7 days ordaining them. On the 8th day, right, the priest would offer a sin, a burnt, a peace, and a grain offering, right, both for the priests and for the people. So in other words, this is where they were ordained for service. They had to engage in that act. When that was done, the glory of God appeared, right? Fire came from God and consumed the offerings on the altar, which obviously showed that God accepted the ordination of these priests and accepted the purification and consecration of the altar. That is what that symbolized. So all of this is covered in Leviticus chapters 8 to 9. Not much explanation to be done here, just more information of what took place. Let's move ahead quickly. Our time is almost upon us. We only have 15 more minutes again, right? Now, interestingly, this is a very important case here. And this is the case of strange fire, which took place with this priest ordination, right? Listen to what happened. There were these two gentlemen by the name of Nadab and Abihu, who were sons of Aaron, right? Was also a priest. So sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. And obviously they were supposed to be priests as well. But they offered strange fire before God. And the word strange there simply means unauthorized fire, which simply means, or what they used to do back then is they would have these censers, which they would burn incense in these censers, right? So could just do a Google search to see what that censer kind of looked like. But these censers, they would put the incense, sorry, the name of it slipped me there. They would put the incense in these censers and make offerings before God. But when it says that Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire before God, and the text says, which he had not commanded them. So what they did is that they put fire in their censer, which again is a device that they would put incense in and burn it, right? And what they would do when they put incense in these censers, and these censers would be connected to these chains, and they would basically be swinging the censer as a way of offering the incense to God, the smoke from the incense, etc. But what they did is that they did that act, so they offered strange fire, meaning in their act of offering this fire to God and putting incense in their censer, they did it contrary to what God had commanded them to do. If you would recall, remember I had spoken about the fact that just prior, God gave them the specific rules as to how they were supposed to go about performing the offerings. Remember I talked about that. That when you're doing these offerings, do it my way. Offer it in the method that I commanded you to do, not doing your own thing. And what Nadab and Abihu did, unfortunately, is that they did their own thing. We don't have much details. The only detail we have in the text is that they offered strange fire which God did not command them to do. What exactly, in terms of the specifics of what they did, and specifically what they did contrary to what God said, we don't know. But what we do know at the end of the day is that whatever they did it contrary to the instructions that God had said about how they were supposed to function as priests. And as a result, right, they died for that. Now, one of the things that we could see, it's not said in Leviticus 10:1 here, but it's shown in Leviticus 16. It seems from the wording in Leviticus 16:1-2 that Nadab and Abihu were actually attempting to enter in the most holy place as well. So in addition to doing their own thing, they were approaching the most holy place, which really only supposed to go in there once a year. What is going on here, really? This is where gentlemen have the mindset that I am going to do my own thing. This is very serious because many times even in the New Covenant now, it is something that I often talk to believers and Christians about, where we want to engage in certain practices which have no type of scriptural basis for them. That is not something that we want to be doing. We don't want to follow Nadab and Abihu. We don't want to, when we are worshiping God, do and make up our own thing or make up our own weird practices. What we do is we follow the guidelines of the scriptures, we follow the guidelines of the apostles. That is what we are supposed to do as Christians. Not your own thing, please. Which shows, of course, the importance of when we're worshiping God, doing worship which is in a form that is acceptable to Him. So fire came from God and basically burns these guys to death. That's a scary way to go. But that is how serious it is to worship God in your own way. In other words, contrary to what God has said, you doing your own thing. Very, very serious. So please do not follow that type of example. So among those, he says this after he killed them. It's an interesting thing. After God killed these two gentlemen, he said, among those who are near me, referring to the priests here, I will be sanctified, and before all people I will be glorified. So what that statement means really is that priests who represent me, in their representation of me, please do it properly. That is what this statement meant when he said this after he killed me. He is saying, in essence, the priests represent me and represent my holiness, right? And therefore, if the priest go about doing his own thing to secure the importance of my holiness in the eyes of the people, I will kill you. If you want to do your own thing and profane my holiness or go about worshiping me in a way which I have not said, and you want to do your own thing, the warning God said here was basically, I am setting an example by killing Nadab and Abihu and letting you all know, please represent me properly. And if you don't, to maintain my holiness in the eyes of people, I will destroy you. That's a frightening thing, really, if you think about that. And what is interesting is that in the New Covenant, one of the reasons why I find this very important, in the New Covenant, where some persons may think, well, that is back in the olden days, the author of Hebrews actually reflects on this. He says, and he gives a warning, he says, let us offer acceptable worship to God, for our God is a consuming fire, which obviously the author of Hebrews has in his mind this scenario here. So in other words, he is saying, in the New Covenant, we want, when we are offering worship to God, that we do it in an acceptable way, in holiness and purity and righteousness, and in the methodology which God has guided us in the new covenant. We don't want to do our own thing, and we want our worship to be acceptable. Very, very serious and sober, and quite frankly, frightening passage of scripture there in the new covenant, right? And what is frightening about this is that we have in the New Testament two people, just like Nadab and Abihu, who wanted to offer a worship to God which was unacceptable, right? And we're talking about here, the two people in the New Covenant were those who came in the book of Acts. You all remember who those two guys were? And the husband and wife, and what they did, they offered unacceptable worship. How did they do that? Well, they were bringing money to God, right? Which is a form of worship. And they lied about the source of the funds. They lied about where they got the money from. And when they brought that to the apostle to offer it to God, they died. That's in the New Testament. That's in the New Covenant. That is how serious that actually is, right? So, looking back at the death of Nadab and Abihu, we obviously see just how serious it is to offer unacceptable worship to God, right? Very, very important. So, again, I didn't mention the name of these people. I just wanted to see if you remembered, but these, if you want to see about those two persons, you could look at that in Acts chapter 5, and their names were Ananias and Sapphira, who offered unacceptable worship and ended up dying in church in the new covenant. Very serious business we're talking about here. So moving on in the ordination of priests, Moses says to Aaron and his sons, now look at this. Remember, the rest of Aaron's son, Nadab and Abihu, have died. He says, don't mourn their deaths. What a thing to say. After persons have been killed by God, he says, don't mourn their deaths. Don't cry for those people. And don't leave the tent of meeting with the anointing oil on you. Because remember, this was taking place during the ordination process. Lest you all die. And some further instructions are given. Don't drink alcohol when you enter in the tabernacle, lest you die. Talking about the priests here, obviously, the point is, we don't want you all being drunk and then doing any sort of foolishness or any sort of wrong thing in your act of offering these things to God, lest you do the wrong thing and you die. You have to distinguish between the holy and the common, the clean and the unclean. You distinguish between those two things. God is saying this to them. And the priests, you all have to teach the people all of the statutes that the Lord has commanded. So part of all of this priestly ordination, God is saying to the priests, these are some things that I want you all to be doing. Distinguish between the holy and the clean and unclean to the people. In other words, teach the people about these things. Teach the people the statutes that the Lord has commanded. That is your role as priests, and obviously in addition to the offerings and upholding the holiness of God. Interestingly, in the New Testament, the New Covenant, all of us are priests. In the New Covenant, all of us are priests, and therefore, all of us are responsible for teaching people the Word of God and distinguishing between things that are holy and common, clean and unclean. So in other words, the point is, whilst, yes, we know it's different in the New Covenant, we're not doing actual sacrifices. We don't have these actual distinction of clean and unclean animals anymore. However, what we are supposed to be doing in the new covenant is the same principle, which is teaching people the word of God. And everybody is supposed to do that. In other words, everybody is supposed to teach. Whilst, yes, we have people who are in the office of teachers, right, in the New Testament church, generally, all believers are supposed to be teaching people about the statutes of God in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, Hebrews says that, speaking to the entire church. In Hebrews 5:12, he says, you all are supposed to be teaching people now, speaking to the entire congregation. So our time is upon us. Our time is upon us, right? So we will complete the book of Leviticus, the second half, or the remaining sections that we have. We'll complete that next week, Lord willing. Lord willing, of course. So at this time, as usual, what we do at the end of these sessions, we allow persons to submit any questions that they have. So based on all that we have learned and we have covered, you can go into the chat of this YouTube. Wow, you know, I should have been looking at the chat here, because now I'm seeing where Rosalind, thank you so much, mentioned the name of the priest. Remember I talked about there was this guy who his sons did not follow the proper process. His name was Eli. I don't know why his name slipped me. I really don't know why, but Eli was his name. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Should have been looking at the chat. So at this time, you all can place any questions that you have based on anything that we covered. You could put a question in the YouTube chat there. Or if you want to leave a comment, right, based on anything that you have learned today or something stood out to you from the session, you could leave a comment. All right, you could do that now. So I'll just leave about 2 minutes for that, and after that I will go and look at the questions that people left, and I will answer them. Okay, so that's our 2 minutes there for questions and comments. So let's go through now all of the questions and comments that were left, and let's see if we could address them here now. So let's see what we have. Okay, so we have good night greetings from Patsy Velasquez, right? And just to be clear, for persons who sometimes wonder why am I referring to people by their full name, even though I know them very intimately. Obviously, it's for the purpose of, anyone else, so that they would know the proper name of these individuals, right? Even though, so I wouldn't say things like mommy or auntie or things like that, right? I'll just refer to you by your proper name for the sake of others. So, Patsy Velasquez, good night, everyone. Thanks so much for that greeting. Dina Richardson giving good night greetings. Thanks so much for that. Rosalind Alexander says, praise the Lord that not only our sin, but the guilt from our conscience was removed by the sacrifice that Jesus made. Very, very nice contribution. Thank you so much, Rosalind. And that is so true. We discussed that in Hebrews. We looked at, I can't remember when I did that message on Hebrews about that guilt that we feel when it comes to our sin. But that is true, and that's what the guilt offering pointed to. So very right. Thank you so much for that. Pointed out the name of Eli for me, right? So again, thanks so much for that, Rosalind. That Eli was the name of the priest who did not correct his sons when they were doing the wrong thing with the offering. They ended up eventually dying as a result of that, sadly. We have Kayla Christian saying, could you connect the believer? So she is pointing out something from the book of Exodus, because we touched a little bit about Exodus. Could you connect the believer who has the veil of blindness removed in 2 Corinthians 3:12-18 and the glory of the Lord? I wasn't clear on that. So good, no problem with that, Kayla. So what was taking place? If we could jump back to what Kayla is referring to. Remember, Moses, when he after he met with the Lord, came down from the mountain, just doing a quick recap so you remember what took place. His face was shining with the glory of God because of his interaction or meeting with God. The glory of God was reflecting on his face and shining. And what took place is that those people covered Moses' face with a veil. In other words, that glory of the Lord was blinded to them. Or in other words, they could not see it. As a matter of fact, they didn't want to see it because they were terrified of it. So Moses put a veil over his face to block the people from seeing that glory of God that was reflecting on his face, right? So the connection that Paul makes to that, and I believe what will be most helpful is if I read it directly, so you'll sort of hear it for yourself, and then I'll give the explanation or the connection that Paul makes. Hear what he says. He says, 2 Corinthians 3:12, right? Since we have such a hope, we are very bold, right? Not like Moses, now listen to this, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. So in other words, he is saying, Moses put a veil over his face, right, to reflect the glory of something, that is the old covenant, and that old covenant was coming to an end. So Paul is making this point. He is saying, imagine, right, that the old covenant was coming to an end. The old covenant was temporary. And even though it was temporary, it was still something that was so glorious, right? And these persons in the old covenant, the Old Testament, would put a veil over Moses' face so they would not see the glory of that, right? Reflecting, obviously, the glory of the old covenant. That's his point he's making in this text here. But listen to the main crux of the matter, of what I was drawing to. He says, but their minds were hardened. For to this day, so in other words, their minds And he says their minds were hardened. He's talking about the Israelites. Because of their hardness, they could not see the full glory of God. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ it is taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. So he's talking about the people who are refusing to enter into the new covenant and remaining under the old covenant, right? They are still blinded. So listen to his point, right? But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, talking about people in the new covenant here, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. So let me pause here and give the explanation of that and how it connects back to that situation in the Old Covenant. In essence, a quick summary really, because a lot of detail could be explained here, but in essence, the children of Israel, or the Israelites back then, could not see the full glory of God. And that full glory of God was veiled from them. So the fact that Moses put that veil over his face represents the fact that they were not allowed to see the full glory of God. That is the simple analogy Paul is making. So he is saying now for us in the new covenant, this is the analogy he's making. People who refuse to enter into the new covenant and view or look at the glory or the greatness of Christ in the new covenant, Paul is saying it is very similar to those persons in the Old Testament who were veiled from seeing the glory of God. So, when a person is blinded in our times or in the times of the Apostle Paul, where they are refusing to look to Christ or refusing to see or accept the glory of Jesus Christ and put their trust in him, Paul is saying those people are blinded just like the Israelites were forbidden, or blinded from seeing the glory of God. That is the point that he is making. There's a really, really interesting analogy, but he is saying for us, and this is where the analogy again comes very interesting. Remember, in Exodus, when Moses went to meet with God, he would remove the veil from his face, right? So there would be no veil blocking his face, and he would have his communion with God in the tent of meeting without any veil blocking his face at all. And Paul is saying, in the same way, we in the new covenant are like Moses, where we are accepting Christ. We are not veiled or blinded to the glory of Christ. We can see the glory of Christ, and we accept the glory of Christ. In other words, by accepting his glory or seeing the glory of Christ simply means we acknowledge and believe and recognize all of the things that the scripture says about Christ. And that is how in the spiritual sense we see Christ's glory or the greatness or the majesty of Jesus Christ in the new covenant. We could see that. Our faces aren't veiled to seeing that. But people who refuse to see that are people who have the veil blocking them from seeing that glory. That is, I hope that is sufficient. I know a lot more could be said about that. But in the essence or the general sense, that is the point or the analogy that Paul was making. And one of the things that Paul actually says in that same 2 Corinthians passage is that the glory of Christ is way greater than the glory of what Moses saw in the Old Covenant. In other words, he is saying Christ is way more glorious than the Old Covenant, as well as another point he makes in that 2 Corinthians passage. But in essence, that is what it means. What do you think was the significance in the grain offering having to be offered with salt? What was the significance of that salt? Again, very good question, Kayla. Remember, the grain offering This is not animals. So think about this. The grain offering weren't like animals, and for animals to represent the purity of the animal, it would be an animal that is without blemish or without fault, etc. Right? Remember, they had to do that when they wanted the animal or offering this animal to be acceptable to God, or pure, holy, clean, without any fault. The animal had to be without any blemish, stain, etc. But since we're talking about grain here, where you are making like a bread or something like that, making like a flat bread, remember we talked about that is what they were given in this grain offering. What they had to do to give the symbology that this thing is pure and clean, they were to offer it with salt. And obviously salt has a purifying aspect to it, right? And that is actually medically true. Salt purifies things. Could go into a little more detail on that, but for time we have to limit, right? But in essence, salt is a purifier and a preserver. That is what salt actually does. So as a result, to symbolize the fact that these offerings are to be pure and purified and clean, given that they weren't animals and it's grain now, they offered them with salt, or God commanded for them to be offered with salt, so that the same imagery would be seen, that this thing being offered is something that is pure and clean and acceptable to Christ. That is why they offered it with salt. Right, let's go through quickly here. Patsy says, I missed the first half hour of the teaching, so I will listen again and look forward to next week's follow-up. Thank you so much. Good night to everyone, and continue to be safe. Thanks for that greeting there, Patsy. I appreciate that. We have Rosalind Alexander saying, I find the connection between some of the Old Testament offering and the offering made by Christ by giving his life is truly amazing, particularly his death taking place outside of the city. Yes, and thanks for that contribution, and you're very right about that. And everything really in that old covenant system and tabernacle was pointing to something that Christ would fulfill. Every single thing about it. As a matter of fact, the entire old covenant system and that tabernacle and the sacrifices and all of that, everything in there was pointing to something that Christ would fulfill. So that's a very good and true comment. And yes, the one where his death had to take place outside of the city, just like the animal was taken and burned outside of the camp. These are really, and you're very right, really amazing how all of those things point to Christ. Kayla gives her thanks, and she understood the explanation. I really appreciate that, Kayla, and I'm glad that I was able to help when it comes to that. Patsy says, Claire, thank you. Yes, I want to see the glory of Christ. And yes, and anyone who accepts the truth of the new covenant and accepts Jesus Christ and what he has done and accepts the gospel message, those are people that are beholding the glory of Christ. That was Paul's point. In other words, anybody who actually accepts Christ and believes in him in the new covenant and doesn't deny or reject him as the Jews did, those who choose to accept Christ, those are people who are seeing the glory of Christ. Just like Moses, when he went into his tent of meeting, he had this communion with God. In the same way, we can see Christ and have communion with him. Right, really interesting. Ian Bain says, I thank God for the offering of Jesus, for I could not see myself finding these offerings so regularly. And if I'm understanding what he is saying there, is that for him to have to be going through, and I actually mentioned that, I was teaching on that a while ago, where, I'm really glad I don't have to go through, and I'm hoping that when we hear teachings like this, that we are glad that we don't have to go through all of those same stuff. And I could see, and I mentioned this when I was teaching on Hebrews, if I had to be bringing animals like that for when I sin, I honestly would not have the money to be able to even afford that, because the amount of sins I have done, the reality is that I wouldn't even have the money to be able to buy the amount of animals I would be having to bring in God's temple. So you're very right about that. Very right about that, Ian. Thank you so much. And to end off here, we have Hazel Ann Christian. She says, always a blessing. Sometimes we take Christ's sacrifice so lightly, but it was such a holy offering. And that is so true. So true, Hazel Ann. Appreciate that comment, and you're very right. And I'm hoping that at the end of this teaching that we have just covered today, that we would have a greater, deeper appreciation for what Christ has done for us, a greater appreciation for Christ and his sacrifice and how he fulfilled all of those things in the new covenant. So those were all of the questions and comments. Again, I thank everyone for sharing, right? Really appreciate everyone. I had a great time going through these things, and looking forward, as long as God spares life, health, and strength, to complete this next week, Lord willing. Right, so in the midst of everything, I always try to just touch on the little situation at hand with the coronavirus. Always remember, our ultimate hope is in Christ. Our ultimate hope is in the future things. Our ultimate hope is our eternity with the Lord. So whatever happens, we are not supposed to be fearful of the events of this life, because our eternity is already secure with Christ, and we have no need for fear. Whether we live or even if we die, one of the things that Paul says, whether we live or die, we belong to Christ. And oh, death, where is your sting? In other words, death really is not even something Christians are supposed to be afraid of, because the only thing death does is cause us to be in the presence of Christ. But also at the same time, we know that Christ and the Lord has promised that anything that is outside of his will for our lives, he will protect us from that. So if it is not God's will for you to come home with that coronavirus, you can rest assured that that is not going to happen to you. Okay, so blessings to everyone. I went a little longer today just because of the sake of, I really want to answer person's questions. I don't like to leave with anything uncovered or unanswered, right? So I apologize for the length there, but I had a great time. Thanks so much. Blessings to everyone. Until next week, Lord willing. Have a good night. Be safe, and blessings to you.